Yes, do come in. Go ahead and have a seat. We've been waiting for you. It's no trouble at all, actually. And let me just, do you have your papers here? Yes, we received your letter about your particular issue. No, I assure you it's not a strange request, as you might think. Actually, I'm all too familiar with the problem. I did read over a bit of your particular case, and I assure you, it's not all in your head, actually, but it seems as though this issue is becoming more and more common. So I would like to help you in any way that I can. And I assure you that this is by no means the strangest case I've seen. Would you like a bit of tea? Yes. Tea, please. Thank you. Now, before I begin, is there anything that wasn't in your case file, in your documentation, that you would like to share? Because I did thoroughly go over the notes here. Yes. Well, all right. The tea is still a bit hot. Right. Now back to what we were talking about. So you're having a vampire problem, yes? I'll assure you that this is by no means an isolated incident. Of course, we're actually seeing more vampire infestations as of recently, or perhaps they've just gotten a bit out of control. They're stepping out of the bounds. Well, before we go further into your particular case, I guess I can tell you a bit about what I know. My family has been in the vampire hunting business for several generations. And of course, you know, there are laws, and as long as they stay on their side of the street, we don't have a problem. But it seems they've been getting a bit bold lately, because you're not the first one to send me a letter of this type. Well, let's talk a bit about vampires, shall we? As I've mentioned, this is something which my family's been dealing with for several generations, and I have quite a bit of knowledge from my own personal experience. Of course, you've got your energy vampires, your psychic vampires. These are the most common type. Now, they could work alone or together. I feel like they often work in packs or groups. And what they do is they slowly drain the life force out of people. Energetically, of course. Now, these are sort of your garden variety vampires. They're actually quite a large percentage of the population. And we're not going to get into that. You know, there's many ways that someone could be an energy vampire. Some people know, some people don't. And then of course you have your fetishist vampires. these are more likely to belong to secret clubs, kink, and things of that nature. But usually, again, there are rules and paperwork and blood tests and things of that sort. And so you have little enclaves of these particular groups as well. Now, then you have the genetic vampires, and these are the people who, they can't help it. It's just in their blood. So oftentimes these people, they try to take care of it in other ways, right? Eating raw meat and things of that nature. And then you have the real vampires, of course. Now these ones, they usually operate in groups as well. And again, there are rules to these sorts of behaviors. As long as people follow the rules, then everything is okay. And we don't normally get called in. We usually only get called in during more extreme infestations. And this is when people, maybe they weren't taught the proper etiquette and rules, or maybe they've just become a bit power hungry and gotten out of control. Either way, this is when usually we start getting called. So, in your particular case, there's not much I can do personally, but I can share with you some of the knowledge and insight that I have learned and has been passed down with my own family. Now, the best way not to get involved with vampires is not to invite them in. When you're dealing with these sorts of undead or semi-dead individuals, you have to be careful. Really, any of these darker forces, they're always looking for a way in. So, as long as you don't let them in, you probably won't have a problem. Now, what if you've already let them in? What if they found an access point, maybe even lifetimes ago? And as normal, as abundant as these psychic vampires are, it doesn't mean they're not dangerous. Especially when you're dealing with a whole group of them. Well, once you realize you have a vampire infestation, that's when the real work begins. Because you have to get them out. And how are we going to do this? Again, there are rules to these things. So, when you understand the rules, it makes it a lot easier to play the game. When you don't understand the rules, and you don't know you're playing a game, then you're probably going to be quite ineffective. Maybe it sounds like I'm speaking in riddles. Do you follow what I'm saying? Yes. Yes, of course. Well, I would say they're everywhere, but there are definitely enclaves. And as I previously mentioned, there are several different types. Now, they may interact with each other, they may not. It's really on a case-by-case basis. But there are certain things you can look for. Now, one of the things with vampires, particularly the psychic sort, is there's often a lot of confusion. And this is one of the ways you'll know you're dealing with a psychic vampire. Oftentimes you will leave the interaction feeling quite confused. Yes, you may go into a conversation with one, and before you know it, all of a sudden you completely gotten turned back around, or everything you've said has been somehow twisted around you. Have you ever heard of louche? Louche. Right, so louche, not a technical term per se, more of a slang term, but louche is emotional energy. It's the energy that we produce by having having emotional responses to things. And this is what the psychic variety of vampire or the energetic vampires feed on, is our louche. So oftentimes these vampires will try and get an emotional reaction out of you. It could be fear, it could be anger, it could be sadness. But this is one of the ways you'll know you're dealing with an energetic vampire. A sense of confusion, a sense of getting twisted up in your head. They will intentionally plant facts. They'll plant information into your mind that isn't true to try and distort your sense of reality. Now, it's especially more dangerous when you're dealing with a group of these sorts, because they can all be planting little seeds of doubt and confusion in your mind, planting false evidence in your reality to make something which is quite illusionary seem real. And they do this again for the intended fact of producing louche, because that's what they feed off of. Now, a good group of vampires, psychic, energetic vampires, they could take one person and they could target that person, and they could continue to generate louche off of one person. They could feed for quite a long time. Lifetimes, generations, in fact. And oftentimes they will seek out a particular type of individual that has let's just say a powerful energetic frequency. Now, I don't want to get too much into the details here, but let's just say that, a human being was perhaps a battery, right? Energetic battery. And the heart being the electromagnetic center. This is where the emotions are generated. So, generally, these vampires would look for someone with a lot of electromagnetic energy. That would be a big heart. Someone who is empathic, someone who cares, someone who is going to emit a lot of energy and put a lot of effort into trying to understand. So, again, you could have the one vampire, perhaps living off of one person for a very long period of time. You could have a whole group of them living off a particular person for a very long period of time. And again, one of the first signs that you may be dealing with vampires is the sense of confusion. Sense of feeling twisted up and jumbled around and constantly being driven to emotional extremes. Does that sound familiar to you? Yes. Yes, of course. Oh. Yes, I do have good experience in this. Right. So one other thing is, they will, like I said, they'll plant things within your mind, or even physical things within your reality, to try and get an emotional response out of you. And it's almost like the more you try, the more you care, the more you give, the more confused you are, and the more louche you're giving out to these individuals. Which is again how an entire group of vampires could feed off of one person for, let's say, a very long time, lifetimes perhaps even. Another thing they might do is they might try to bait you into certain conversations. Now, one thing about these vampires is they're cannibals as well, so they could have a particular target that they're feeding off of, but they could also be feeding off of each other. So one of the ways they might do this is by trying to bait you into certain conversations, bait you into certain reactions. And then once you've taken the bait and said whatever thing they wanted you to say, or something satisfactory and similar, they go back to their little group and they whisper in each other's ears and they get all bent out of shape. Because, what is an energy vampire but someone who feeds on energy? They're generally not very discriminating. Yes. Well, of course, as I said, the energetic vampires are actually quite common. They're everywhere these days, like cockroaches. Now, the other types of vampires. Sorry if I'm skipping around a bit here. It's just so much to tell you. I hope this is making sense so far. Alright, well, that's the energetic vampires. Now, again, there are people who legitimately have medical conditions, genetic medical conditions, whereby they might need more raw meat and blood in their diet, of course. We're not going to judge anyone. Again, there are rules to the game. So, oftentimes, these people will either seek out willing participants, or they will go about finding it in other ethically sourced ways. Now, if everyone is consenting and people are in agreement, that's perfectly fine. So, we're not going to discriminate here. We're not going to throw shade or hatred on anyone for their particular medical condition or their particular genetic makeup. However, when people step out of the bounds, this is when we have problems. And consent is very important. One of the major rules or laws of the universe is free will. Now, this is a free will universe. You might say, free will, do we even have it? Well, short answer is yes, but the majority of people never access their free will. This is completely another topic entirely as to why people don't access their free will, generally basing off of subconscious patterns and the lack of self-consciousness or self-awareness. In order for one to have free will, one must know themselves. One must take accountability for their actions. And the majority of people are not willing to do so. So, regardless, it is a free will universe. But, again, as with any kind of law, there are loopholes. So, oftentimes, you can be made to consent through trickery. I'm trying to think of a good example here. But as I said, with the vampires, when we think of vampires, we tend to think of the movie or the book versions. And there are many inaccuracies, but there are accuracies as well. So when we think of vampires, we think of turning into a bat and flying off into the night, or sleeping upright in a coffin and only going out during the day. Those things are not real in most cases, although they could be in some. I can't claim to know everything. But one of the rules is, like I mentioned in the beginning, you have to invite them in. So there are ways that you can invite them in without being fully aware or conscious. And this is where they may find an access point. Now again, we're not speaking about the ethical vampires here. I do not want to discriminate against anyone just because of how they were born, how they were made. But again, we must follow the rules. If we are in violation of the rules, then eventually there's going to be consequences. So, have a sip of my tea. So, there could potentially be ways in which you might be tricked into consenting. And this is what you've got to watch out for. The trickiness. There's tricks to these people. And if you are unaware, then you might easily fall into one of these traps that they lay out. Things should be above board. Things should be consented to perhaps in writing, to protect everyone involved. But that is not always the case because, of course, there are always going to be people who break the rules. And what do we do about people who break the rules? Well, eventually it's going to catch up with them when they're being foolish and sloppy and making a lot of careless mistakes, which usually happens after they've grown emboldened, which is, I believe, what has happened here in your case. So, don't let them in. And if you find out that they're in, how do you get rid of them? Well, narcissism. Let's use the rules of narcissism here, because let's face it, a lot of vampires are highly narcissistic, which really just means that they hate themselves, and that's why they have to feed on other people. And they often feel quite a bit of shame in this, so they further bury the shame, and they continue to go about their evil deeds. But one of the best ways you can kill a vampire, metaphorically of course, is to not feed it. So if you realize the vampire's gotten into your house or your energy field, first you must banish them out. Now you can do this in a number of ways. I've gotten quite forceful with it as of lately, as I've been quite infested with vampires myself. Command them out. Command them out of your space. Yes. Tell them to leave. That's the first thing you can do. Now, if they're persistent, they won't give up, then you must deny them access to your louche. So, again, louche is generated through emotional response. So what you want to do is basically want to ignore them. Lock the door. Throw away the key. Don't let them in your house. If you've let them in, then banish them, kick them out, and don't give them a response. They are looking for a response. They're looking to harvest your energy. That is exactly all that they do. It's all they know how to do. And it is why they live so long and oftentimes have a lot of material prosperity, because they are energetically harvesting the energy of unsuspecting victims and using it for their own personal material gain. So you want to banish them out, make sure you're not inviting them in, and don't give them your louche. Don't give them your precious energy. Ignore them, cut them off, pretend as if they don't exist. This is one of the things oftentimes when it comes to dealing with the paranormal. The more power you give them, the more power they have. If you take away their power and you take away that emotional response, then there's really not much they can get from you. And they have to go and find somebody else. And the more that people find out about these things and how to protect themselves, the less they'll be able to feed on us. And the weaker they will grow as they wither away. Well, I think we ought to save that for another time. I really wanted to talk about the emotional vampires today because, of course, as I said, they're practically everywhere these days. Yes, they do often operate in groups, although they can operate independently. But I've noticed they tend to operate in groups, yes. Well, oftentimes, victims are unsuspecting. Well, their sense of reality has been distorted, so practically living in an illusion, yeah. Like I said, they plant false ideas in your head, they plant false evidence, they give little signals or dog whistles that would only have meaning to the intended victim and to no one else. So, usually the victim will think that they have the problem. They'll think they've gone mad, they're crazy. They think that the vampires around them are their friends. But nothing could be further from the truth. Now, once you start to see these things, you start to see them everywhere. And once you begin to learn how to protect yourself, you'll no longer invite them in. And once you realize that they're in your space, it'll get easier to clear them out. Yes, right, of course. Well, like I said, just don't give them your energy. Don't give them your time. Just generally stay away from them. Once you start to recognize them, you'll begin to know. Oh yes, they love your secrets. Oh, they love your anger. Any negative feeling, anything they can twist and distort for their own purposes, they love it. So don't give them anything, or give them fake information. That's a good way. You could twist them around, give them fake information. Tell them what you want them to think. Tell them all different things. Well, like I said, if you find one vampire, you usually find a whole nest of them. They're really not as scary as you think. They want you to be scared of them. That's why they remain hidden in the shadows. Oh yes, the creatures of the night are much more powerful if people don't know that they exist. And their victims are much more powerless if they think that they're the problem. So, it's a simple psychological game. Oh, well, the less you give your power away to these beings, the less you give away your loosh, the more you have for yourself. Right. Like I said, I've been seeing a lot of cases of this lately. Well, I do have to be going. I'm glad we could meet today, and I hope this was helpful. If you have any further questions, please leave a comment. And we can pick up this conversation later. No, don't go out there and kill vampires, because psychic vampire, I wouldn't recommend it. Eventually they'll go away of their own accord. Just stop feeding them. Alright. Good speaking with you. Just phone me if you have any more questions. Cheerio.